Good morning. I'm Ed Gabriel, a proud member of Council on the American Ambassadors, former U.S. ambassador to Morocco, currently a member of the board of the United States Institute of Peace. Why I was selected for the military panel, I'm not sure, but and also the head of the American Task Force on Lebanon. We've got three super distinguished guests with us with a deep understanding of the issue that we're going to talk about today. Justin Logan is Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at Cato. I have much longer description, but they told me to stop.
Short is better.
Farzin Nadimi, who's a Senior Fellow with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Banam Ben Telblou, a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, what we're going to do today is have a discussion. I'll maybe do a scene setter, if that's okay with you guys. And then we'll have brief remarks from each of them. And that'll be followed by some questions that I'll have of you, and then we'll turn to the audience. When I served in Morocco, and I would meet with King Hassan, and I talked too much, he got in the habit of doing this to me. So if you see me doing this, you'll know we got to get through it somehow. So let me do a scene setter first for you. What the Israeli-Gaza war has underscored, as has been the subsequent escalation of tensions as we've seen across MENA, it's Iran's disruptive role and the need to address the harm caused by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard and its proxies. We're going to call them affiliates, since I heard Ryan speak this morning. Iran's political, economic, and geostrategic interests in the MENA region have predominantly been secured via proxy or affiliate infiltration using coercive force. And IRGC, of course, has been central in that effort. This regional influence project that they're doing has required considerable investments to maintain control in countries where Iran has engineered a state capture through local proxies and allies, many of which are considered terrorist organizations and are under sanctions, embargoes imposed on them. Influence in these countries has further taken the form of actions to enhance Iran's image in the political and popular cultures of these targeted audiences. I've seen this firsthand in Lebanon. Tehran is implementing this project most visibly in Lebanon, but also Arab capitals, Baghdad, Sana'a, Damascus, and zones of influence, West Bank, Gaza, Bahrain, through a combination of financial support of proxies, draining of institutional resources, and disinformation campaigns. A relationship of dependence and loyalty to Iran is robustly established through the combination of direct financial support from Tehran or through these actors, draining of public and national resources, plus a sophisticated information operation. All of this allows Iran to maintain a forward defense strategy through which it battles its enemies in other states. Tehran also has invested millions of dollars in influence messaging to shape public opinion. These operations have sought to manipulate by penetrating political and information environments in the targeted country. So it's the battle against Iran is going to be uphill. And it's now solidly entrenched in its spheres of influence. So this all makes for the need to fight entrenched influence of Iran and offer alternatives, hopefully today, by protecting and strengthening local resistance to this influence. So let this be the starting point of our conversation, as we also have as a backdrop the recent escalation between Israel and Iran. Let me first turn to Justin for 5 minutes of remarks.
Sure. Well, yeah, it's a privilege to be here. I'd like to thank Joyce and the Council for having us, and for all of you for being here. Obviously, this is a very hot topic, and hopefully we'll keep the zesty tenor of the previous panel going on this one here today. So I want to start by maybe annoying everybody in the room and zooming out a little bit and asking the question what the United States needs from the Middle East in general. We have a tendency in Washington to start the movie in the middle. You say, well, why are the two sides fighting at all? And you get caught up in the kind of operational and tactical questions without zooming out and asking the strategic questions. And at a fundamental level, the United States wants from the Middle East something similar to what it wants in Europe, which is the prevention of, and forgive me for the IR jargon, it wants to prevent a regional hegemon. Right? We don't want one country to dominate the Middle East, just in the same way we fought World War I, World War II, and the Cold War to prevent one country, alternately Wilhelmine and Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, from dominating Europe. And in the Middle East, there are all kinds of witchy things having to do with, in particular, oil markets. If you could envision Saudi Arabia conquering Iran or Iran conquering Saudi Arabia, that actor would have big impact over world prices of oil. And we've historically not thought that that would be a terribly good idea. And so I think you heard warnings, particularly around the signing of the JCPOA, I recall, in 2015, that Iran was a candidate to be a regional hegemon, to dominate the Middle East. And I think people generally agree that would be a bad thing for the United States. But I think if you look at the plausible pathways that are sort of assumed for Iran to achieve regional dominance, they're really not there. So Iran uses a number of mechanisms, including its conventional military forces, and as has been mentioned, proxies, to try to pursue its interests across the region. If you look at its conventional military forces, they're not terribly impressive. And we'll probably talk about Iran's missile capabilities, which are arguably the exception to that statement. Iran for decades has had a military doctrine centered on what's called defense in depth. We saw some measure of this during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, but defense in depth is essentially allowing the enemy to advance while counterattacking frequently from the flank. So at a conventional level, you have Iran using towed artillery, using a number of things that indeed could make life messy for an invader, but it is not a sort of blitzkrieg type doctrine that you've seen in the 1930s in Europe, or even the kind of advances that Russia made through Ukraine, going over flat territory, poorly defended, et cetera, et cetera. So in conventional military terms, Iran has a defensive doctrine and isn't terribly impressive even at that. In non-conventional military terms, that's kind of where all the action is. As has been mentioned, of course, Hezbollah has been used in particular as a deterrent to a large attack on Iran's nuclear program. I think it's generally assumed that were there to be a large attack on Iran's nuclear program, the Hezbollah trigger would be pulled and a fusillade of ordnance would drop on Israel. But I think the broad picture was illuminated by the DIA, the most recent DIA report on Iran's military capabilities, talking about the conventional forces today remain, quote, primarily oriented for defensive missions and continue to rely on asymmetric tactics, right? So they're leaning on these proxies as ways to advance their interests. But I think if you zoom out and ask yourself the question, is Iran sort of sitting in the catbird seat? Does Iran have a great shot at dominating the region? It's certainly causing a lot of madness and mayhem, but I don't think that the madness and mayhem holds a plausible path to cowing even its regional challengers, to include Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I think threats are a combination of intentions times capabilities. So if either of those factors is low or close to zero, that brings the threat level down, even if the capabilities or the intentions are quite high. And I think in Iran, we have a case where the capabilities have been overstated in a meaningful way, whatever one assumes about intentions, which I think we should probably assume pretty bad things about Iran's intentions across the region. So I think at the risk of putting everybody to sleep, I'll leave that as a scene setter and look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Farzin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the Council of Ambassadors for inviting me to such a distinguished group of statesmen and ambassadors. But when talking about Iran's military intentions and capabilities, one cannot ignore the deep-rooted history and ideology.
A little louder, please.
Can you hear me? Well, when we are talking about, when we want to talk about Iran's military intentions and capabilities, I would love to talk hours about Iran's hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, but we have to go back in history because that is what the Islamic regime in Iran is. And as a starter, I want to ask how many of you remember Mr. Mohammad Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister of Iran from 2013 to 2021 during the Rouhani administration. He was Western educated, a smiling, very charismatic person. But when he was talking to the foreign media, he loved to talk about zero-sum game. He complained about how the United States and the West are playing a zero-sum game with Iran, that this persisting Cold War mentality, we have to change that, we have to start playing a non-zero-sum game when everybody can win. This leads to loss of everybody. But while talking about this zero-sum game, and when some people repeated his assertions, he ignored the fact that it was actually the revolutionary regime in Iran who, from the very first day after the 1979 revolution, started a zero-sum game. And that was the war between the Haq or the right versus Batil or the right. This was the design from the very beginning of a zero-sum game when the Islam, their ideology had to win. They had no choice but to win against this imperialist Zionist bad war. And this was the benchmark. When talking about Iran's military thinking and strategy, we have to consider the deep roots of ideology and history. In 7th century, when the Prophet Muhammad was starting to think about, after consolidating in Medina, going after the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, who were weakened after the Byzantine Sasanian War in 602 to 628 AD. The Muslims in Medina first thought about they have to consolidate their grip in power in the Arabian Peninsula first to secure their logistics, their routes before going after those empires. And they started to do that. They had to the thought of starting a treaty, peace treaty with the powerful tribes in Mecca. And that treaty, negotiated, and it was cemented in 628 as a Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And they still talk about it. They teach it in their military academies that it was on paper it was a shift, a switch from war to peace. But what the Prophet Muhammad at the time had in mind was to buy time until they are powerful enough, until they take care of the small tribes in the Arabian Peninsula. When they consolidate their power, then they can go after the Roman and Persian empires, and that was exactly what they do. What they had to do was just wait it out until the Meccans make a mistake, just annul the treaty and go take Mecca. And that exactly happened 1 year after that. So the Iranians, including some of the nuclear negotiators, still talk about it, write about it, speak about it, the Hudaybiyah Treaty. But what Hardliner said, and continues saying, that it's not a path toward peace. It was just about buying time. So we have all the key elements in place, so we can go for the win. And that is in modern terms, that's a zero-sum game. Post 1979 revolution, the Shah of Iran had a non-zero-sum game in mind. He wanted to work with world powers. He wanted to work with NATO to cement this defensive posture against the regional threats and also the Soviet Union at the time. But with the 1979 revolution, Khomeini came to power. He already had in mind who were the enemies. And one was Israel, one was the United States. And he created this non-ending war with Israel and the United States because that was part of the ideology. They needed to have an enemy to survive and to continue their grip in power. And that continues to this day. To do this, they needed also the tools. The tools were the weapons, and the weapons that had to be, they spent a lot of money on that. They had to develop them, and it takes time. It takes time to develop weapons, modern weapon systems that they had. The nuclear project it's a bigger story. We can talk hours about it, that how Iran started their nuclear project from the very start as a military program, and probably they never completely abandoned the military dimension of their nuclear program. They needed time to develop and produce in large numbers the delivery systems. Who else wanted an ICBM without a nuclear warhead? That is a stupid decision. If they wanted an ICBM without a nuclear warhead, nobody has one. And yes, Israel might be a larger military nuclear power in the region. With there are talks about hundreds of nuclear warheads. But for Iran, it's in their mind, for Iran having a few military nuclear deliverable nuclear warheads are enough to deter Israel from launching a nuclear strike against Iran, and that will give Iran to foster their alliances in the region, develop those relations with their proxy groups, and do exactly what they're doing now.
Excellent, thank you. Benham, welcome.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me well? Is this all right? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you both, and thanks very much to the Council for hosting us today, and also to the Cosmos Club. It's a beautiful, historic venue. Lots of storied individuals have passed through these halls. Actually, we were just talking about what it takes to get membership here. Maybe we can all get an honorary membership.
A number of people could sponsor you.
We're looking forward to it. What is no laughing matter, though, and forgive that softer introduction, is Iran's military capabilities and the military aims of the government of the Islamic Republic. You've just heard in great detail some of the origins and the evolution, ideationally, strategically, of how Iran's military doctrine and strategic thinking came about from Farzin and Justin. In the previous panel, you had a policy discussion about sanctions, about effectiveness, about trying to throw Iran off, right? Whether you should best do that through diplomacy, whether you should best do that through sanctions, military, whatever. I'm going to say the quiet part out loud. The Islamic Republic has seldom changed its foreign and security policy in the past 45 years. Probably tactically and strategically, we can count it on 1 to 2 hands the number of times they have changed. And in all of the instances and when they changed, when there was like a counterweight of pressure going in the opposite direction, when they sensed the strategic environment changing, they went back to the same views, the same interests, the same policies that they harbored. And that's a larger empirical truth that we have to deal with. States seldom change their foreign and security policy. unless there's some kind of significant domestic issue or exogenous political shock. In this context, the ideology of the government of the Islamic Republic matters very much because it works much more like a cabal, a cartel, a mafia than a traditional nation state. How and why is that? In fact, the regime doesn't really have much in terms of defending the nation, the country of Iran. What it is much more interested in, and what it puts those resources the panel debated and talked about in the previous panel towards, is defending the revolution, defending the fact that what is important in the title of the government is not Iran, it is Islamic Republic, right? If you look at many of the government institutions in Iran today that have acronyms with the I in it in the acronym, the I, perhaps with the exception of Central Bank of Iran, seldom stands for Iran. In the entity we're discussing today, it is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It is not the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is not some accident. This is by design. There were parliamentary debates about this right after the revolution in 1979 that talked about the transnational nature of the mission of this revolution. You have Iranian religious, political, and military officials talking about, during the height of the Syrian civil war, that it's more important to keep Assad, the client state, if you will, the dictator in Damascus, in power in Syria than it is to retain Khuzestan province. For those of you who don't know, Khuzestan province is a province in Iran southwest that is oil rich, right? So this is the ideology of the regime. It's about putting regime first, not national interest and the public good first. It's precisely why, I think it was Narges was sitting here in the previous panel, she was translating this quote that Iranians who have been protesting against the state have been saying since 2009. And the Persian is, Nagaze na Lobnan janam fadai Iran, which it's beautiful, it rhymes. It means not Gaza, not Lebanon, I sacrifice my life only for Iran. And this is a secular, domestic, nationalist pushback by the population against an authoritarian and Islamist regime. So they don't view with value the population, the foreign policy adventurism and the sponsorship and the creation of these proxy and terror groups, be it in Gaza like Hamas, be it in Lebanon like Lebanese Hezbollah, or elsewhere, because they sense this tension between nation and regime. But this tension, as we're kind of trying to point to today, political terms, policy terms, IR terms, this is not an accidental tension. This is a tension baked into the way the government of the Islamic Republic conceives of its interests and then spends money to secure, defend, and promote those interests. Both gentlemen before me mentioned history. Because this is a panel about military capabilities, military power, there is one conflict you have to know to understand the origins and the evolution of the future of all the threats, with the exception of hostage-taking, which was before, or cyber, which is after, that we face from the Islamic Republic in the past 45 years. And that's the Iran-Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War in Iran's own domestic parlance is styled the imposed war or the sacred defense or the holy defense. Basically, anybody who's anyone in Iran today has cut their teeth on this issue, fighting in the war, serving in the war, having an important position in the war. The constellation of people that matter today had some kind of credibility, had some kind of important position during that war. But for our purposes here in Washington, those of us not trying to get jobs in the government of the Islamic Republic, why does this war matter? Because it was during this time that the late Shah's nuclear program, Farzin spoke about just a moment ago, the military origins of the nuclear program. It was during this time that the nuclear program was resurrected. Some of you may know that Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear reactor at Osirak in 1981. In fact, no one talks about this part. It did Iran, which was saying death to Israel, then a huge favor, because Saddam later ended up using other forms of WMD against Iran, including chemical weapons. The Iranians had actually tried in 1980 several times using American planes, using F-4s to bomb this nuclear reactor, but they didn't fly high enough and the munition did not detonate in time, so it landed like a thud on the reactor dome. So they resurrected the late Shah's nuclear program because they sensed they needed nuclear deterrence against this guy who had nuclear capabilities in the past and was moving towards chemical in the present. So nuclear has its origins in this conflict. Drones, which are everywhere today, from South America to Africa, to multiple battlefields in the Middle East, and now critically in Ukraine via Russia, Drones were first used by Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. Very cheap, kind of unmanned combat aerial vehicles, kind of like in World War I when people flew and threw grenades down, and also literally tying cameras, there's documentaries about this in Iran, to low and slow flying kind of piston or powered little prop planes, basically function as very cheap ISR for the regime. Ballistic missiles, for over 2 decades, the U.S. intelligence community has been saying Iran has the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Well, it was during the Iran-Iraq War that the Islamic Republic went to Syria, Libya, North Korea to try to procure, ultimately, ballistic missiles. And in what was first called the War of the Cities, Saddam and Iran trading Scud launches against each other's population centers with one another, now led to an arsenal that Iran fired twice in 2024 at 2 nuclear-armed countries, Pakistan and Israel. So this is becoming the tip of the spear of the threat that we face from the Islamic Republic. The regime, especially with this new ideology, has talked about the export of the Islamic Revolution. Well, it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps at the forefront of that export. And you saw this in Lebanon with the creation of Lebanese Hezbollah. That happened during the Iran-Iraq War in 1982, 1983. But the first terror proxy group, and I am okay with using the word proxy, it's more of a socially contrived term, but I'm going to use it, is Badr in Iraq. And the idea of using someone else's downtrodden and dispossessed minority to achieve foreign and security policy aims of your own has its origins in the Iran-Iraq War. Using someone else's street to contest someone else's state. That is essentially why, with immense respect to Justin, the only difference I would really put out here is the regime on paper is not strong, but what the regime is able to achieve, because its bar for victory is much lower than our bar for victory, it doesn't need to have the conventional overmatch. It doesn't need to contest Saudi Arabia 1-to-1. It will fight you where it lacks in terms of balance of capability. It'll make up for it in balance of resolve and balance of interest. These are 3 critical balances that people in this town confuse and conflate or ignore to their peril. I didn't say Justin did this, I say other people outside the room do this. But that's why when you have mayhem in the Middle East, when we look at Iraq, when we look at Afghanistan, when we look at Syria, when we look at Yemen, when we look at Lebanon, we say, oh, what a mess, what a cluster situation. It's within those clusters that the Islamic Republic can achieve victory because its bar is lower. The political bar, the barrier for entry is lower. And the nature of the investments it's made in terror and proxy forces, in asymmetric maritime capabilities, and now, critically, when we're talking about this ballistic missile program, in terms of unmanned aerial threats on the low end, mortars, rockets, IRAMs. On the mid-tier, one-way attack drones and unmanned combat aerial vehicles. And on the higher end, land attack cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. The Islamic Republic's mastery of this unmanned aerial threat spectrum was based on its ability to procure components from abroad, produce and reverse engineer things at home, and then ultimately proliferate them abroad. Right now, the Houthis in Yemen, which is a terror proxy group that Iran did not create, but it co-opted when it found yet another downtrodden, dispossessed group willing to shoot at the same people that the Islamic Republic was willing to shoot at, right? Chaos, lower barrier for entry, put guns in the hands of someone who has no other alternative, and they will become loyal to you. And this constellation of either created or co-opted terror and proxy groups that we now face from Iran is called the axis of resistance. And the ability of the regime to slowly bring on different elements of this axis in different theaters at different times, we're seeing in real time now since October 7 in this new Middle East. We are all living in history-making moments. There's a Persian saying about this, "Salhay sarnevesht saz," destiny-creating years. These are destiny-creating years in the security strategy of the government of the Islamic Republic. When the U.S. left Afghanistan in August 2021, a month later, the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said, this is not the same America of 10, 20, 30 years ago, right? So if we ignore all of these destiny-creating changes in the security strategy of the government of the Islamic Republic, its ability to enter a conflict lower, control an escalation spiral, escalate to de-escalate, and be able to win politically and perhaps even, dare I say it, socially, religiously, economically, when they are militarily, conventionally overmatched, that seems to be their secret sauce. Because if you look at the region from Tehran's perspective today, if you had the first Secretary General of NATO say the point of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. The point of this axis of resistance is to keep the Iranians in, the Arabs out, Arabs down, and the Americans out, so as to do the things they've been saying since before these guys even got into power, which is the death to Israel stuff. These guys actually mean it. They cut their teeth on fighting against the Shah in the 60s, contesting Israel in the 60s and 50s, and obviously contesting America. So this is their unholy trinity of whom they have put their sights on. And then anybody that aligns or balances or bandwagons with these groups, particularly now as you see the Gulf Arab states, particularly now in the spreading period of the Abraham Accords, they will put a target on their back too. The point of the overall foreign and security policy towards those Arabs is to force them into a policy of begrudging accommodation, to make the Arabs on balance not have to trust that America will have their back, such that Americans in our political discourse today, we say that, oh, the Arabs want us to fight Iran to the last American, and such that the Arabs in their political discourse over there say, oh no, the Americans want us to fight Iran to the last Arab. And this tension between our partners and our alliance structure in the Middle East exactly benefits the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, because that tension, that chaos allows them to enter the conflict lower, force a policy of begrudging accommodation that looks like the détente you see between Saudi and Iran, and ultimately go about erecting and sustaining the rest of their revisionist foreign and security policy architecture, which is why in the medium to long term you will see a tightening of ties between Iran and China, Iran and Russia, and older partners like Iran and Syria and Iran and North Korea, because you'll have the great power patrons at the top, the non-state actors at below, and this kind of hybrid, neither asymmetric nor conventional military capability that they can apply and put to different theaters. And ultimately now, I know the nuclear issue is the sexiest issue. I'm going to end with this. I'm sorry I went so long, but this is an important point. I am of the belief, and I'm trying to put this into print, I just haven't had time, that the Islamic Republic has achieved the deterrent dividends of having a nuclear weapon without having paid the political costs of weaponization. And this entire architecture of threat that we talked about, the axis of resistance, the asymmetric maritime threats, the mastery of the spectrum of unmanned combat aerial vehicles and low-tier, high-tier, mid-tier ballistic missiles, rockets, mortars, drones, cruise missiles, has given them this sense of invincibility. And because the ideational origins of this regime are exactly what they are, rather than feel content or assuaged or secure when they have achieved a certain level of capability, they will not sit back with it. They will now lean into it. And leaning into it looks exactly like the missile exchange and drone barrage you saw on April 13th. So expect more, not less, of this overt stuff from formerly a covert warfighter.
Thank you, Anam. Very, very much appreciate it. Well, yeah, before we get to our first question, maybe we get a reaction, like a 1-minute reaction from each of you.
Sure. Person, do you want to? Okay. Yeah, I certainly cannot go back to Byzantium, so I will concede the 7th century to my colleagues on the panel here. I do want to highlight a little bit there's a guy in town who's been talking a lot about strategic empathy, right? And if you want to unpack what an adversary is up to, you got to think, well, what does the world look like from that adversary's point of view? And I think that if you look at, the Iran-Iraq war was mentioned, some unpleasantness there. The United States was supporting Saddam Hussein, who invaded Iran, used chemical weapons against Iran. And during that war, the Iranians did all sorts of rhetorically hysterical things. There was a big fountain in the middle of Tehran that they dyed red, and so it was a fountain of blood of the martyrs, right? And they were never going to relent. They were never going to go to the UN Security Council, which was a tool of the Zionists and all the rest of it. And then after the military command in Iran told the leadership, we're losing, this is not going well for us, what did they wind up doing? They wound up dealing with the Zionists that control the UN and having a settlement at the UN. So I think there is, if you judge Iran on the basis of its rhetoric, particularly for domestic consumption, you would say these guys are fire-eyed fanatics who are not responsive to rational cost-benefit analysis. But when the rubber meets the road, historically, they have bowed to material reality. So you have the nastiness of the Iran-Iraq war, The United States saying there's an axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and Iran looking out into the world and saying Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons and what happened to Iraq happened to Iraq. North Korea does have nuclear weapons and what didn't happen to North Korea didn't happen to North Korea. Which of those would we prefer to be? The choice isn't that hard. And then, of course, leaving the JCPOA. So I think there's a lot of room for mistrust on all sides here.
Thank you. Farzin, 1 minute.
Justin previously spoke about defense in depth, which in Iran they call it mosaic defense.
Maybe you speak up.
And also asymmetric warfare. I think they are now past that stage. They have been talking about effects-based operation. That's actually adopted from the American military thinking. They now are confident in their weapon systems and the effect that they can get from their weapon systems, that they can achieve their objectives with minimal force. Minimal force is part of the warfighting principle, economy of force. And they are now very confident. And with all this that's happening, that they can achieve whatever objective they have with minimum force. However, they still need the nuclear weapon as a deterrence. But what they did and what they have been doing with their proxy forces, the alliances, the axis of resistance in the region, is that they can gradually, with time, if they have time on their side, they can achieve their objectives with minimal force. However, only one time they felt endangered. They felt the danger of losing time, and that was when the young Iranian girls and women went to the streets and took off their hijab and called for their ouster. And that was the only time that Khamenei went to his security military commanders and called for acceleration of whatever they were doing.
Thank you very much. Great introductions to this subject. Let me just play right into what you've been talking about with this question. The U.S. took out Soleimani in 2020. Israel took out Zahedi in Damascus April 1st. Iran retaliates directly in a foiled strike to Israel. And Israel surgically strikes back. Have the ground rules changed for combating Iran? In the past, Iran attacked Israel and the U.S. through surrogates, and Israel and the West struck back at the surrogates. How are the new ground rules likely to change or evolve from here? Maybe a quick answer from each of you. Benham, let's start with you.
The ground rules are changing, but to say that the shadow war is gone altogether would be incorrect, or that the proxy stuff is gone altogether would be incorrect. What the Islamic Republic is able to do is layer one threat on top of another. And rather than have you, say, going from one period to another period, they are kind of creating this wedding cake-like effect. Let me give you a couple examples. One is now the talk of procuring, more advanced Russian conventional military hardware. It doesn't mean that Iran is going to be a conventional power overnight, but it will mean that you will see more kind of conventional elements in Iran's otherwise unconventional military capabilities. Iran has this robust terrorist apparatus we've all been talking about. U.S. government has said Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism for decades. But if you look at the evolving patterns of terrorism, especially in the past decade and a half, the entity conducting the terrorism on Iran's behalf recently has not been Iran or its proxies. It's been transnational criminal syndicates, from Mexican drug cartels to Eastern European gangs to Canadian bikers, even trying to assassinate someone in Maryland this January. So there's a changing face. And so what I mean by that is none of these changing faces erodes the architecture below. Just because Iran is now coming out of the shadows doesn't mean that the shadow threats are not still there.
Thank you. Farzin.
I think the dynamics have changed. Now the goalposts have moved, and now Iran has seen that they can use conventional weapons directly against Israel without major repercussions. And Israel, for the first time, has used force against Iran's main proper, and that could happen in the future as well. I don't think Iran is very unhappy about the result of its strike against Israel. My estimates, now that we are in a closed session and Kehan Daily in Iran is not listening to how if Farzin Nadimi said that we won that operation. But the truth is, they managed to get between 9 to 10% of their ballistic missiles to their targets, and they hit exactly what they were intended to hit. There have been speculations and some reports from Israel that those missiles were not carrying a full explosive payload. So it was a measured. Yes, they launched over 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles against Israel. That was major military operation from every aspect you look at it. But they also were careful enough to reduce the explosive payload of those missiles. And I believe many of those cruise missiles and drones might have actually played the role of decoying the defense systems. It doesn't mean that next time they will not launch full power missiles. They will probably do, but it has changed the dynamics. It has changed their thinkings. They might in the future they might still try similar messaging to Israel by launching missiles directly at Israel. And what Israel did, I think, by not claiming responsibilities openly for the very effective small operation they conducted in Iran, I think that was a mistake. They should have claimed responsibility.
Interesting. Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the backdrop here is about, is Iran winning or not? Is it advancing in the Middle East? And I think, at the risk of putting myself outside of polite company here, I don't see Iran winning. If we had launched between 250 and 300 projectiles at a target, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, and 10% of them weren't interdicted by air defenses, we would rightly have our hair on fire asking ourselves, what are we doing, right? And so this is what happened. This is what Iran did. And I'm an old-fashioned realist in international politics. I don't think there are a lot of rules. The original question was about rules. But insofar as there are rules, and I think this speaks directly to you guys, consular buildings tend to be off limits for military operations. And so I think there's real escalatory potential here that was evinced last month by what I think was a quite bold strike, and we've been litigating, was it a consular building, was it adjacent to a consular building, how much damage was done to the consular building. I think the message that Israel wanted to deliver was delivered effectively. I think it was received effectively, and I think that the Iranian response was telegraphed in important ways to prevent further escalation. And what did happen was, I think, an embarrassment for Iran. So I just don't see this, maybe we can talk, I have a whole riff that I can do about the Houthis, but I just don't see them really as standing athwart the region.
So let me, because I want to get at some of these questions to give the audience a chance to ask a few. Let me just flip this around a little bit. I read an article recently by Middle East Institute, and they said maybe, who used the word strategic environment, the strategic environment may be changing. One of you did. So let me ask you a question about that. Do you think maybe, given recent events, that maybe time is ripe for more diplomacy? Is Iran starting to signal their preference for looking away from the proxy battle? Have they seen what the costs are? Assad's not seemingly playing with them. He's not joined this effort against Israel. So the question I have for the three of you is, are proxies getting isolated? Is there a change here? But more importantly, is this a time to really perhaps double down on diplomacy? Are they signaling a need to double down on diplomacy? If so, what goes with diplomacy? But now, okay,
We got
2
some
minutes.
strong views
2
here.
minutes.
Okay, yes. Don't even do this, just cut my mic.
Okay.
No. But a diplomatic strategy, absolutely. You know, we talked about those proxies operating in essentially failed states. That is a permissive environment for the government of the Islamic Republic to continue to exploit people with grievances, to put material support, a gun in their hand, to be able to, at low cost and on high return on investment, be able to achieve Iranian foreign and security policy aims and have us either be forced to absorb it or whitewash it or have to escalate, pay more political and military and economic costs, given the cost of our munitions, given the cost of Israeli munitions, to have to contend with it. So this is why I do see Iran on the win here. And even if the Iranians do put out a hand, the region, the way they've been able to integrate force, it's not this ridiculous, I'm sorry, it's not your question, but it's not this ridiculous binary of diplomacy or economic or military, it's integrated. The way they go to the way they've fostered the détente with the Saudis is a knife in the back with the Houthis for a decade, and then have the Saudis see that their patron is wobbling in terms of supporting them, and then a handshake to solidify that the regional balance has changed.
So
This is the approach. They actually have a successful diplomatic approach. We need to have an equally successful, clever diplomatic strategy, not one that locks in their gains, but one that helps to erode them.
excellent. Thank you. Good information.
Well, the problem with the Iranian regime we have is that the historical symbolism resonates pretty strongly in Iran. Well, I think they are always open to diplomacy as long as it serves their objectives. As with the JCPOA, I believe they never intended to have a long-term agreement. What was their intention was only, as I use the historical example of the Hudaybiyah Treaty, is to buy time, and they showed a heroic flexibility, as the Supreme Leader said, so they can have enough time to develop their weapon systems. To develop a hypersonic missile, you need time. To develop nuclear weapons, you need time. And having a treaty or agreement called JCPOA or whatever just serves their purpose, and they can walk out of it anytime. Right now, yes, they are emboldened, but they might see that instead of investing more on their proxies that have their own limits, we have this self-deterrence between Israel and Hezbollah, for example, or the balance of deterrence between Hezbollah and Israel.
I'm going to get into that in a second.
They might want to invest more in their weapon systems. And because they see they can achieve that effect with less cost. And having supersonic cruise missiles. If they had supersonic cruise missiles, those cruise missiles could reach Israel much quicker than several hours, which was laughable.
Faster than a drone.
Much faster. They could have better hypersonic missiles. They have more effective weapons that they could use against Israel.
Yeah, I hate to have agreement on the panel, but I think we all agree. I think it's also probably
I'll come up
fanciful.
with something.
That's right. We'll get it going here. I think it's probably also fanciful to think about a big diplomatic breakthrough happening while the campaign in Gaza is grinding on. I mean, I just think that's probably a real impediment to a diplomatic détente between the U.S. and Iran right now.
So let me talk about Hezbollah a little bit, and following up on diplomacy. Does Amos Hochstein have a chance to really avoid an escalation? He's done a pretty good job so far. Israel doesn't seem to want to escalate right now. Iran and Hezbollah surely have said they're not interested. I mean, there's an escalation, but it's within certain rules of engagement. We'll start with you, Justin. I mean, is there a chance to really avert another problem and avoid hostilities and actually avoided another war like 2006 between Israel and Lebanon.
I mean, I think there's a chance. I'm not so much of a realist that I'll say there's not a chance. But I do think that most of the decision variables lie with Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, I think the Iranians have signaled pretty clearly that they view Hezbollah as a trigger to be pulled, again, to sort of deter an attack on the nuclear program, right? The danger is that if you use that weapon now, it will be degraded should you need it as a deterrent vis-a-vis the nuclear program. So I think that the signals that have been coming out of Israel vis-a-vis the government's intentions on Hezbollah, the constraints on Netanyahu posed by his coalition are real cause for concern. But nothing is foreordained, right? We can envision a world in which this doesn't go.
Okay, well, thank you. Have we had a chance to all react to that? So let me just ask one final question and then maybe open it up to the audience. And I'm sure it'll spark other ideas for us to have a conversation about. So, so we've talked about the failure of past administrations. We talked about, you know, Obama, Trump, Biden now never getting to that deterrence factor and changing Iran's behavior. What are the prospects short of war to restrain their nuclear program? And what is your recommendations on how to do that? I'm going to have Behnam go last this time.
Go ahead.
Farzin, you go first, please.
Well, that's a very difficult question, obviously. Well, the U.S. and Western deterrence against Iran's and its proxies has failed in the Bab el-Mandeb and Red Sea. They have been pretty consistent in threatening. They have been pretty. The Houthis have been pretty consistent in threatening the shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. The United States has some leverage, but I think a real threat of military action against Iran, a threat that leaves something to chance, according to Thomas Schelling, should be the main course of action against Iran. They should feel real and credible threat of a military force to change their behaviors. And I think we haven't offered that yet.
Interesting. And Justin,
Yeah,
what are we going to do?
I could tell you. I think if we're going to talk about Schelling, though, it's important to point out that the famous contribution that Schelling made here is that the threat "stop or I'll shoot" implies if you do stop, I won't shoot, right? There is a threat, but also an assurance backstopping that claim. And I think, again, to get back to this concept of strategic empathy that we're all supposed to be talking about, I wouldn't trust the implicit assurance if I were the Islamic Republic. And I think that, you know, withdrawing from the JCPOA, I mean, we had a little riff about this on the first panel, it's just a really hard argument to make that from a non-proliferation perspective, this was a smart thing to do. I mean, I think we've seen high-enriched uranium emerge, medium-enriched uranium go up dramatically, low-enriched uranium go up dramatically, centrifuges go up by tens of thousands. Now, you could say the JCPOA didn't make Iran into a nice country, the Islamic Republic into a nice government, rather. True. But if you're worried about this not nice government in possession of more or less fissile material, more or less centrifuges, it was a real own goal, if you'll forgive a soccer metaphor, I think, that we're still trying to dig out of. And I don't have a plan to say over 18 months we could do this, that, and the other that would get us back to something that, again, put a meaningful lid on Iran's enriched uranium. So my creativity will not get us that far.
And you don't think the time is ripe for more diplomatic action?
Again, I just think it's very difficult in the current context with Gaza. You know, I mean, I think even the Saudis who are trying to get this, maybe we'll get to the normalization proposal here. They're trying to be, very pro-American, very pro-Israel, and stay on side, to sustain the soccer metaphors, with respect to this. And the Saudi Foreign Ministry just came out and said Israel's committing genocide in Gaza the other day. So I think, the idea that the Iranians are going to be like, to be sure, everything that's going on with these horrible people killing all of the Palestinians. However, let's get down to brass tacks here and talk about enriched uranium. Again, strains my creativity.
So, Behnam, before you talk, because I want to give you each a chance to kind of wrap up your thoughts, why don't we just ask for questions from the audience before we lose our time? Ambassador, Jim?
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question. Justin made reference to winning. Justin made reference to winning. And I guess I'd like your perspective. If you take the Bush administration, second Bush administration, you take the Obama administration, you take the Trump administration, now you take the Biden administration. At which points, all points or no points, have the Iranians thought they're winning?
Somebody want to answer that?
Not tied to the nuclear?
Yes, not on defense, but on offense.
At which point were they winning?
They thought they were winning.
Yeah, at which point, in their perspective, right? Because this is actually critical to much of what Justin was saying. I'd love to answer that.
Yeah.
Is I would say during the Obama period. Why? This is not a political argument, right? The other panel kind of danced around this question. How did the JCPOA come about? You saw my colleague talk about pressure. You saw the other guy talk about the giveaway. It's more of a cocktail. If it's a martini, which one is the vodka or gin? Which one is the preponderant ingredient, right? In my view, the preponderant ingredient is pressure. But once you get in a situation to adjudicate that pressure, the reason why I would say under the Obama administration it went to a win is because of that secret channel in Oman. Because a black and white question, a monadic question, a question like lights on or lights off, enrichment in Iran, yes or no, was translated into a measure question, a volume question. How much enrichment in Iran? And that philosophical, foundational, conceptual giveaway, yes, indeed, did make the JCPOA and JPOA possible. But it also eroded this larger, decades of non-proliferation policy that we've had with Taiwan and South Korea and Vietnam and anyone else that was interested in going down this path in the future. So for that purpose alone, the strategic win the Iranians were able to achieve is in that race that the previous panel talked about, sanctions for centrifuges. They were able to double down and wait and wait and wait and cash in the leverage created by the centrifuges to philosophically change the underpinning of our Iran policy.
So, question.
I was very interested in the cultural dynamics of the Iran-Iraq war that you put a lot of emphasis on, and how that has been a building block for the Iranian society today. Help me understand why that's such an important building block. What were the passions on both sides, and why was this number one strategy among, in other words, I thought it was America, Saudis, Iran, and Israel. Those were the enemies, but you're almost saying Iraq was the enemy.
So let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll just wrap it up as well as that. One other question. And then you can go to answers and wrap up.
Well, this question involves a long story, but I'll cut it to the barest possible essentials.
Or we won't eat.
Many people believe that there are nuclear weapons in Pakistan that say property of the government of Saudi Arabia on them. Other people agree, believe, including the U.S. Deputy Chief of Staff some years ago, the Korean ambassador to the U.S., etc., that Iran has gone the same route with North Korea, and that there are weapons in North Korea that are pledged to the Iranians if they call for them in a crisis. And the Chinese have, in the past, escorted the designer Fakhrizadeh to be present at the third North Korean test. He's the one the Iranians killed. Do you think there could be anything behind the Iranian bombs in North
I'm
Korea?
going to take, if there's no more questions, one more question, and then we'll do a wrap-up on all three questions, plus I hope you're taking good notes on the question. Ambassador?
Thank you. Back to the nuclear weapon issue. We were told earlier today that they could have a nuclear weapon in 7 days. The fact that they have not done this yet, in view of all that you've been talking about this morning, is it in fact the worry of a serious U.S. military response, given the fact that what
Great
they've
question.
seen recently with the U.S. is actually retrenchment? They've seen Afghanistan, they've seen these various things. Are they really worried about a major U.S. military strike, or is there some other reason, political reasons or whatever, that they have not yet moved forward on that, which would be an absolute game changer?
Great question. Okay, we'll do a wrap-up. 2 minutes each, please, 3 minutes max.
Let's talk about that at lunch. I'm not sure, and let's do this. It goes back to that new change, I think, that missiles, terrorism, asymmetric maritime capability, and as they said a year and a half ago in their unofficial but semi-state affiliated press, a robust civil quote unquote, nuclear program gives them the deterrent dividends of having a bomb without paying the costs of the weaponization. So they may feel they've already achieved that, right? What is the major achievement of Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the guy who was not supposed to be Supreme Leader, and he's now the longest running dictator in the Middle East? His achievement is he sustained the Islamic Republic's anti-American and anti-Israeli disposition while growing these capabilities at a period of peak American unipolarity without inviting a conventional war based on all those conventional imbalanced metrics that do not favor the government of the Islamic Republic relative to the US or any of the US's regional partners. Why has there not been an overt, direct, declared, even Farzin talked about the Israeli strike, it was an undeclared strike. Why has there not been such a strike on Iranian territory? Because deterrence by punishment, the threat that leaves something to chance, the sword of Damocles, that this architecture of threat that they've created for the past 2 decades has worked. It doesn't mean that, to quote actually a colleague of mine, but this is off the record, but a colleague of mine, not the one who was here, you don't go to, forgive me, but this is his crass analogy. He used to serve in the agency. I think they come up with these kind of things. You don't go to third base with Scarlett Johansson and then go home. You don't build all of this architecture, pay this cost, and then not go all the way. But the propitious conditions are not present. The deterrent dividends that they already have are sufficiently maximized. The threat of military force, either by the US or Israel, is still there. And the fact that they might be detected. So all of this, like that martini analogy, functions as a cocktail that means that based on 2011 DNI, it's not a matter of capability. It's just a political decision. And this political balance has not yet been achieved.
Very
in my
good.
view.
Excellent.
One very quick comment about Iran-Iraq war. Iran started its ballistic missile program during the Iran-Iraq war. However, they only started it when they were on the offensive phase inside Iraqi territory. When they were on defensive, when they were defending against Iraqi aggression during the early phase of the Iran-Iraq war, they even didn't think about ballistic missiles. They only wanted ballistic missiles when they wanted to capture, to seize Baghdad. And they needed such a weapon to conquer Iraq. And that continued after that. Shahab 3 was designed and obtained from North Korea for the purpose of defeating Israel.
Just add one quick comment with regard to seeing a little bit more. The Iranian medium-range missile is the same missile exactly as the North Korean.
Yes, sir. That was a modified version of the North Korean Nodong. In the old times, during the 90s, I used to work for Iran's aviation industries. I did my military service with Iran's Ministry of Defense. At that period, there were a large number of North Korean technicians, engineers working for Iran. They used to be transported in blackened buses with windows blackened. And they were very much involved in many Iranian military projects, especially ballistic missile projects, but also nuclear. And we should not forget that the Syrian nuclear site that was bombed by Israel in 2007 was run and developed by the Assad family. However, it was paid by Iran.
Great, thank you. Justin, bring us home
Sure,
from
I'll try.
third base.
Again, I can't help much on the Iran-Iraq War's foundational contribution to Iran's mentality. I will say, if there are Pakistani or North Korean nukes being held in abeyance for Iran, should it call them up, it would do great violence to pretty much everything I think about international politics. So I sure hope that that isn't the case. I think it's not the case. If it is the case, I'd be quite surprised. I think that the threshold nuclear state that Behnam and the questioner, ambassador, brought up is an interesting one. I do think that there are all sorts of costs, not just the threat of an American or potentially even Israeli strike on these facilities, but there are all other reputational, other knock-on effects that would have, some positive attributes for Iran, but also some drawbacks for Iran, violating the NPT, et cetera, et cetera. So I think like getting into their decision matrix on this thing and thinking about how they might think about it is really interesting, and I look forward to reading the article if you write it up, because I don't know what I think about it. And then nobody asked me to do my Houthi riff, but darn it, I'm going to do it anyway. So we've gone really into this thing by thinking that the Houthis are doing great violence to what's freedom of navigation, right? And freedom of navigation sounds so good. Who could be against freedom of navigation? But what we're doing is using $1 million, or in some cases more than $1 million missiles, to hit sensors, radars, and other things that are, I was going to say Radio Shack, I'm showing my age, I don't think it exists anymore, that are essentially Radio Shack kit. You're talking about using $1 million to destroy a capability that costs $5,000. This is a bad trade-off from the point of view of the United States. And the net effect of the Houthi strikes against shipping has been to route ships around the Cape of Good Hope rather than come through the Red Sea. It's not a zero cost, but amortized over thousands of containers on a ship, it's pretty close to zero cost. It holds up, it delays supplies, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a real problem. I don't want to say that it's a zero problem, but we have done the quintessential American thing, which is use dazzling, spectacular technology to counter some sort of jerry-rigged capabilities to the strategic end that I think is murky at best. So I think that zooming out a little bit and looking at this from a broader perspective, rather than how can we win today against the Houthis, is probably called for.
Boy, have I learned a lot, and I think we all have. Thank you very much. Very stimulating and inspiring. Thank you. Thank you all.